Hello, my name is Christy Schertz. I teach biology and AP Environmental Science, and my colleague Erica Hardbarger and I switched to mastery grading and a new grading scale this year. So I'm going to briefly go over the changes that we made. The first thing that we did was we switched to mastery grading. So with mastery grading, students' grades are based on evidence of individual learning and understanding. And this requires more frequent assessments. Students can also do retakes of assessments, but that is limited as well, and there's some parameters I'm going to talk with you about. In mastery grading, we don't grade on behavior, which is doing things like turning in all your work and turning your work in on time, although we have parameters for that. Homework, classwork, things that we do for practice goes in as a category in our grade book, but it's worth 0% of the grade. We also switched to a new grading scale that is similar to a 4-point grading scale where A is equal to 4 points, B 3, C's are worth 2, D's 1, and F's are worth 0, which really is a more equitable grading system. It's really a grading system that teachers used up until maybe a couple of decades ago. And so the 14-point grading scale is very similar to that. When we chose 14 points, we discussed a 4-point grading scale, we discussed an 8-point grading scale, and we decided to go with the 14-point grading scale, and we looked at a lot of different models. So this is our 14-point grading scale, and really the first 3 columns are the ones we really like for mastery grading. The last 2 columns are the what we had to develop to use our gradebook system, Infinite Campus. But if we look at the first 3 columns, we can break down the points and really what our descriptors are of performances, and it creates a more holistic grading. Now, this column here, percentages in Infinite Campus for assignment marks, this is what we had to do to work within our current gradebook system. And then sometimes for quizzes and things when we're not exactly using performance descriptors, but more of percentages of questions that students got right, this is the range that corresponds with a 14-point scale. So what we like about the 14-point grading scale is that a lot of our grading is based on performance descriptors, like did they master the content? Was it accomplished? Was it proficient? And this actually makes it faster to grade, which was a nice surprise. We believe that it's a more accurate way to grade, and we often grade our work holistically. We also grade things that are done independently instead of with group work, because we really want to assess independent student learning, what they actually understand. And then we also base our grade on rubrics and other guidelines. One of the ways that has made grading a lot easier is to have a stamp. And so my lab assistant or I will go through a stack of labs or activities and stamp them. And we grade it holistically with a check mark. It's a lot faster to grade. We pick key parts that we know are done independently to grade. What we've learned is that students at the beginning of the year, really for about the first month and a half, had a lot of difficulty with the 14-point grading scale. They didn't understand it, but then they caught on and it was okay. It took our brains a little while to really understand this too. We've been teaching a long time. So my students would panic sometimes because if they got a C on an assessment and it went in as a 7, they thought that was an F. It's because 7 out of 14 is 50%. But Infinite Campus wasn't programmed that way. So we used assignment marks on Infinite Campus, and where we can program the mark of 7 to equal a 75% in Infinite Campus. So we had to just go over that in several different ways with students, post it, go over it when we pass back an assessment, etc. So we also learned not just how to use Infinite Campus marks for grading. We also, in the first few weeks, we adjusted the low end of our scale. We had to adjust some wording to be more accurate. And the low end of our scale, we made some adjustments with percentages. We rarely give below a 2, which is equal to 50%. I will give a 1 to students who I believe guessed on a test more than they tried. But if you don't go below a 2, which is 50% in the grade, it doesn't tank a grade if a student does poorly on a certain assessment. Now, there's a lot of quizzes that I give, especially in my AP class, that there's no curve. And so I easily have this spreadsheet where, for example, if I have 15 questions on my assessment, this is the translation into the 14-point grading scale. So if a student gets a 7, which is less than half correct, they get a 3, which is a D- on the 14-point grading scale. And so this is the translation. I also post this spreadsheet for students so they can take a look at it as well. Again, when you're grading for mastery, the grades are based on evidence of student understanding. We don't give credit for practice work because it's often copied. We know homework is copied, math problems are copied on Chegg, students take pictures of assignments and text them to their friends. We also don't know who's doing that work at home, if it's the student or somebody else. And most group work does not also go in the gradebook. Our assessments are called mastery checks in biology. In my AP class, I'll use the words quizzes. In both classes, we use the words exam for more cumulative assessments. In this type of system, and I've been to a couple of trainings for standards-based, for mastery grading, for equity grading, and the way to keep kids accountable for their practice work is frequent quizzing. And then also retakes for the opportunity to prove mastery later. For us, we have limited retakes to 1 retake because of the time it takes to create the retake. The agreement for doing your retake, the ability to do a retake, depends on, did you do all your practice work? Can you show evidence of relearning? Sometimes we do lab assessments. We'll do a lab quiz, especially if it's a lab where it's a lot of collective group work. We want to make sure that every kid understood what happened in the lab and not just copied the lab paper from their friend. And so we will sometimes, if we have time, create a lab quiz just to check to make sure that every student understood what happened in that lab. What we like about mastery grading is we feel like there's more accurate grades based on what the students actually understand. It gives the students a way to improve their grade instead of just turning in a bunch of papers before a grading period and you don't know if those papers were copied, you don't know who did those papers, and they're really usually poorly done if they're turned in right before a grading period. How kids can make up their grade in mastery is through doing retakes, relearning the material and doing retakes. To make retakes easier, we have them on paper instead of electronic, and so whatever kid is coming in for whichever retake, and I happen to give my retakes Tuesdays at lunch and then also on student help. Now, of course, lunch, I make that decision to give up my duty-free lunch once a week for retakes, and that's it, once a week. But I'll have kids coming in taking different ones, and so having it on paper and handing the right paper to that student makes it a lot easier. You can also work retakes into the class period itself during independent learning, and sometimes my students will ask if we're doing some independent learning. They'll say, can I do my retake now instead of coming in later? And I'll say yes. Now, I have a screenshot over here of something that Erica developed later in the year, because a lot of kids were just coming in for a retake and really not showing evidence of trying harder or relearning or redoing the practice material. And so this is the requirement to be able to do a retake or a redo. And so you can pause the video and you can see the type of requirements that Erica started to develop later in the year, and that I'm going to adopt as well to make sure that students are ready to do a retake. Now, there are some challenges with mastery grading. It does take time to make frequent assessments and retakes, and so that is a huge time suck. However, having a friend to do it with you is really important, and it also saves a lot of time. 2 brains are better than 1. And when they're made, they're made. So next year, we're going to have a whole arsenal of mastery checks and also retakes. I also started using AI this year just to give me sort of a foundation to work on for retakes and also more frequent assessments. You can copy and paste basically a PDF of a book, and they can create questions for you. Now, the AIs aren't great. I have to edit it a lot, but it saves about 50% of the time. AI can also take an assessment and reword the questions for you. But again, you have to do a lot of double checking and proofreading and making sure that the rigor of the questions is appropriate for your students. Other challenging things is that it's difficult for students right before report cards are due, because the formula that students have used to always bring up their grades, or that their parents know, well, bring up your grade by turning in all your missing work. That doesn't work in mastery grading. To bring up your grade, you must show evidence of understanding, and that's not turning in a bunch of work at the last minute. It's actually doing retakes. So I tell kids, hey, I'm really glad you made up all this work, but it goes into the gradebook in the 0% category. What you need to do is, now that you have relearned this material, you need to come in and do a retake before grades are due. I will say that my biology 9th grade students, I thought were going to struggle with this, and they're the ones who are doing the best with it. It's actually my older AP students, my 12th graders, that are struggling with this the most. So I'm going to do some adaptations next year with my AP kids to get them to do their practice more. They tend to try and wing it and see how they do, because there's always a retake. And so I'm going to make some adjustments with their class next year. Our next steps in this process, after we've gotten used to mastery grading and the 14-point grading scale, which honestly took about a semester to really get in our brains, because it is a big change. We've been teaching a long time. And so now in the second semester, starting in about March, we felt like we were ready to tackle the next sort of thing, which is more of standards-based grading. And in this particular method, we want to start really pinpointing the learning objectives that are needed for each performance expectation for science. And what we do is we look at our CAST-specific documents. So our CAST test, which is our science test in California, has documents that say students will have these types of questions on their CAST test, or they could have these types of questions. And so we've developed learning objectives. And so we have this paper here of our learning objectives based on, and our skills and knowledge. And then what we do now is we're creating our tests based around learning objectives. And this will allow us to pinpoint for MTSS, multi-tiered student support, which particular student learning targets a particular kid did not understand, to try and provide support for those particular learning targets. So that is our next steps in this process. Thanks for listening.